Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our host, MUJI, and thank you for the introduction, Robin. So MUJI asked us to reflect upon this notion of what designing more with less actually means. As Robin said, I'm a designer. I actually was laughingly talking behind the scenes with these guys, say I classify myself as a failed engineer and a mediocre designer. That's why I consult now for a living. At a fundamental level, I believe in actually creating new solutions for people and in uncovering new value for companies. So I'm not actually going to talk about IDEO's work tonight. I'm not going to talk about IDEO design thinking. I'm going to talk about what this means for me and what I've learned over the last 15 years of being a designer and how my kind of like perception of what designing more for less has actually evolved. So I'm going to rewind. Rewind about 15 years. I've just graduated the Royal College of Art in London, and I've moved out to the countryside to work with James Dyson to design vacuum cleaners for a living. They've just launched DCO1 to rapturous success. DCO2, the canister, followed up. And we started designing this product called DCO2 Recyclone. Recyclone used less parts, it used recycled plastics, it used recycled metal castings, it used organic pigments. It was designed in such a way that it would be a lot easier to take apart at the end of life. But fundamentally, I mean, you can tell it's the green one, right? I mean, it's kind of slightly funny that we had to make it green to make it a recyclable product. But at the end of life, it would be much, much reduced impact. So we reduced the number of inputs, and where possible, we designed to reduce the impact at the end of the life. But in the end, it's still a vacuum cleaner. It still gets shipped to a store. I still bring it home in a box. I still plug it in, and it draws 13 amps if you're back in the UK out of the plug. And that's as much as you can actually do. And in the ensuing years, I've actually watched, and I myself have struggled with this idea of designing more for less, of actually designing for reduced impact and lower impact, because fundamentally, I think we've been asking the wrong questions. We've all experienced those subpar offerings that are labeled green and ask us to like buy into the brand, but actually deliver a subpar experience. Fast forward almost 10 years. It's actually a conference room somewhere in New York, and it was a summer afternoon. Things weren't actually going very well. We were presenting to a client, and our work really wasn't hitting the mark. It was in the packaging space. It was we were looking at doing sustainable packaging. And the client leant forward, and he was a pretty enlightened guy, and said to me, and he explained in metaphor why our work really wasn't working for him. And he said, Iain, when people go to Home Depot on the weekend and they buy an electric drill, it's not because they want plastic moldings, metal casings, and an electric motor. It's invariably because they want a hole in a wall. And he said to me, you really need to focus on the value we're trying to deliver. What's the value we're trying to deliver? Don't focus on the product itself that we're trying to design. And that really reframed my perspective on design, on what it meant to design, on what we can do to design better impact out in the world. So designing more with less. Design is actually a discipline that fundamentally thrives on understanding constraints, reframing constraints, and sometimes breaking constraints. What I found and what I learned from that experience and ever since is if you focus on the commonly understood archetype of what you're designing, you limit your possibilities. Fundamentally, by focusing on that archetype, you focus on color, you focus on form, you focus on materials, you focus on delight. And don't get me wrong, those things are incredibly important, but they lead to incremental solutions, not disruptive change. Incremental solutions. What we need to do is expand our horizons back, to think at a bigger level, at a bigger systemic level, and understand how design can affect all parts of that system. By doing that, the constraints that you're playing with become very different and very impactful. Change at that system level is about using design to alter behaviors of consumers, behaviors of companies, behaviors of stakeholders. And we can use design to, across channel, distribution, relationships, offer, and experience. So I wanted to actually just share what this epiphany means for me. 3 stories that these guys, I'm sure, are going to inspire you by stuff out on the edge that's super cool. These 3 stories are incredibly mainstream, and I take heart in the fact that they're incredibly mainstream because this stuff is happening on a day-to-day basis. Number 1, Natura. Natura is a Brazilian cosmetics manufacturer, for those of you who don't know. Underneath it, it says, people actually want to look their best. They don't really care about cosmetics and shampoo. Right? Fundamentally, we don't buy shampoo because we want shampoo. We buy shampoo because we want lovely-looking hair. We want to deliver upon that promise of that value. So can we actually design a business that allows us to consume conscientiously? Natura thinks we can, and they are ever inspiring to me. They're a Brazilian cosmetics company that back in the late 90s reoriented their entire model around social, environmental, and economic impact. And they've done so to tremendous effect with explosive growth ever since. This is an essence from their CEO, who I had a great pleasure to meet recently. Life is a chain of relationships. Nothing in the universe exists alone. Everything is interdependent. We believe that only by recognizing the importance of relationships can we achieve peace, solidarity, and pleasure in all aspects of life. They get more than anything else that the relationships they build are core to what they do. So what's interesting about Natura? 4 things. They moved to a direct sales model. They're the Avon of South America. They grew 800,000 consultants in the space of the last 10 years. There's 800,000 small businesses going into communities. It's fantastic to see that kind of growth at a grassroots level. Those 800,000 consultants built a network that lives off the current infrastructure. Those relationships already exist because it's my mum, it's my sister, it's my neighbor. Everybody knows the Natura woman because she lives on your block. That fundamentally exists. Now, those relationships are super key to what's fantastic about their model, is that they've dealt with the closed-loop system. At the end of life, I give my packaging back to her, right? I'm done with my bottle, I give it back to her. She takes it to the plant, it gets washed out, it gets recycled. Or, as you can see here from one of the, this is a picture from, this is how they sell. It's literally a cupboard in the back room and they pull out what they want. These are the refill bottles. Snap off the top, she turns up, refills your shampoo, walks away again. It's much more about, you know, the relationship between people than it is about selling a brand or selling the package. The promise is in the relationships. Add to that the fact that they have fundamentally changed their botanicals that come from indigenous species in the Amazon, farmed through fair trade with local farmers. That fundamentally they have a low water policy, and that the water they do use is recycled rainwater from the Amazon. And you've got a business that is kind of jaw-droppingly on the point in terms of like triple bottom line. And they're doing it well, and from a profitability perspective, they've got proof to show it. What we find about this is the emerging economies are often places where problems are being solved in really interesting ways. The constraints in which they're designing are very different to the constraints we have in North America or in the EU, and as a result, they have to have these kind of like band-aid workaround solutions, but when you look at them in a new light, they're tremendously inspiring. So increasingly, we're going out to India and to China and to Africa to inspire offerings here in North America and the EU, because the way they're doing things are very different. Number 2, Zipcar. How many people are members? A fair few, okay. So there's nothing new here. Zipcar's been around for a long while. What they got was that people really want to move seamlessly and easily and affordably. I actually work a lot with Detroit. I work a lot with Ford Motor Company. The car, and so I've spent a lot of my time helping them think about designing cars that will be much more successful. But this is an inspiring model. It's a completely different paradigm. The car has actually set an expectation for freedom and mobility more than any other product in the last 100 years. We use our cars for a multitude of different tasks, from picking up the kids at school, to grocery shopping, to that weekend away. Yet most of our cars actually sit idle for 90% of their time. Big investment, and actually the cost of investment for a car is much more than the ticket price. There's parking, there's insurance, there's gas, there's maintenance, there's repair. The cost of ownership is second only to owning a house. And yet this investment sits idle for 90% of our time. So Zipcar understood that mobility was a need, and that in certain contexts, aka New York City, Chicago, where I'm from, any other major urban metropolis, that fundamentally the car's not always the answer, or at least owning a car isn't always the answer. And it's increasingly going to be that way. 50% of us live in urban centers right now, and it's predicted to be 75% by 2040. And a lot of those are being built in Asia. Increasingly, owning a car is not going to be part of the equation. So what can we do to give people access to mobility in different ways? They led with convenience, they led with value, but there's a tremendous, positive impact here as well. For every one Zipcar that's on a lot, it takes 15 cars off the road. For every one member reduces the number of trips and the number of miles that they drive, and they start to see the car as much more part of a larger system, a larger mobility system that includes walking. That'd be good. Gets us fitter. Biking, fantastic, right? Public transportation. They start to look at it as a system, and as a result, actually the impact is huge in terms of the number of trips driven. What's also interesting as well is the car's a bit of a crutch. I go and buy one car, yet I have a multitude of needs. You start to see these behavior changes around people using Zipcar. They go and rent the car they need. On the weekend, I need an F-150 because I'm hauling stuff. Whereas, that next weekend I'm going away with my girlfriend for a weekend, so I want a top down, I want a car that I can take the top off of. They start to change their behaviors, and we start to understand that the car as a singular solution isn't necessarily the only option. What's inspiring to me about this is around this notion of utilization of infrastructure. There are millions of cars in the US sitting idle on people's driveways right now. And if you look at the legislation change in California that's happening, that's allowing peer-to-peer car rentals with Get-Around, SprideShare, and what's the other one I had here? Those two, at least being two, we're starting to see new opportunities arise where people can make money out of those resources and fundamentally, leverage their infrastructure much more effectively. So the question for this one for me is, does consumption have to mean ownership? Because I don't think it does in all cases. When is shared ownership okay? How might we deploy installed infrastructure in different ways? And the third one, you get to see my iTunes library. Yeah, actually. I hope it's okay. Is interestingly already out of date because of Apple's announcements this week. People want to discover and enjoy new media in interesting and different ways. Will access change the way we consume? I think it will. We're trading digital for physical. We're moving away from the physical world, and we're increasingly consuming digital experiences, which is good because we have an abundance of digital resources, and actually we've got pretty much a scarcity of physical ones. The reason this is exciting, and actually somewhat it makes me laugh, this story, to put it up there, is 5 years ago, I was designing packaging for the then-to war between Sony Blu-ray and HD DVD. Packaging that was going to allow the HD DVD's media disc to jump off of the shelf. And 5 years later, we're looking at, no one goes to stores anymore. We're streaming media, right? The platform themselves of media discs is defunct. In 5 years, we've moved beyond a fundamental, technological platform to a point where there's no store, there's no shelf, there's no packaging, right? There's no trip to the store to go and buy music. It's a discovery-driven media experience curated for me at my fingertips. And now with iCloud, actually everything, all my stuff wherever I want it, whenever I want it, which is like stuff we couldn't have imagined about 5 years ago. And I look at this, is it a sustainability story? No. Does it have sustainable impact? Absolutely. In terms of, it led with a different value and it has a knock-on effect. And I think you really have to design those things that people want and then allow the knock-on effect to come. So as technology enables seamless delivery of data from the cloud and directly to us, our challenge becomes actually what to do with it. New experiences built upon this goldmine of data pop up every day. Just looking at the thriving digital startup scene here in New York kind of tells us testament to that. And if you look at services like Spotify that are coming over from Europe, ownership is becoming irrelevant too. It's simply about access. I can tune into whatever I want, whenever I want. And the challenge then becomes fundamentally curation. We're getting to a point again where we have an abundance of digital choices and a paradox of choice around those things. And using design to get back to that fundamental, what's the value we're going to try and deliver it, is going to be key to these businesses being successful in the future. So to wrap up, from designing more with less, I think I passionately believe in figuring out how to create new value instead. And ask yourself this question: how can we not how can we design with lower impact, but what value are we trying to deliver in the first place? What constraints can we push and pull, and how can we look at things at the system level? Thank you.